Hi everyone, and hi John.
Oh
Thank you
yeah.
for being here with me today. We are recording a series of very short videos that are helping us to reflect upon a little bit what has been said during the previous weeks of the symposium. So this video is actually the third, let's say, recording that we are putting on the website, but we are going to discuss actually what happened during the second week, which was the week of the 5th of November, where we had a workshop, Dig Where You Stand, with Owen Griffith as a facilitator and leader of the workshop. And we had a panel discussion the same day in the afternoon called Decentralizing Political Economies as a Hacking Strategy, which saw Manolo Callahan and Annie Paradise from the Center for Convivial Research and Autonomy, connecting from San Francisco, Kubat Sreder, who is a professor and independent curator based in Warsaw, Sarah Lowell, who is the cultural policy leader at the Liverpool City region, connecting obviously from Liverpool, and I was also part of the panel discussion that was moderated by you. Yeah, so I'm just curious to hear from you
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
what
I,
you were thinking.
I thought I thought on reflection again it was a really interesting session because the symposium I think is benefiting from some space in between the sessions for um, people to reflect upon. And I thought if the first set of sessions, as we've already discussed, really brought to light the urgency and the necessity for uh, Western or Northern Hemisphere institutions of art and education to reach out to non-Western forms of critical and political thinking if they want to decentralize themselves and wanted to colonize themselves realistically. Um, that the the discussions we had on the 5th around hacking education um, kind of took that one step further, really. I mean, via thinking about how we are all trapped within um, circulations of economy. I think that that's a very interesting thing to do. I mean, as you know, we've worked together for many years, and I've been um, I've always been very interested in the idea that neoliberalism might be an asymmetrical condition, that we are living in a period in which we can't simply step out of neoliberalism and claim that we can adopt the standpoint of another. And whilst that has been seen to be um, a problematic view, it's not a view that's just mine. A problematic view because it would, on the surface, seem to both legitimise and almost raise a white flag to the condition of neoliberalism. I think it's becoming generally accepted that that seeing ourselves as being within these systems of circulation and having, as Cuba Schroeder pointed out so clearly, having to find ways to work within and out of
Mm-hmm.
these systems of circulation begins to enable us to see more clearly how we need to find new forms of tactical activism that might enable us to do so, rather than simply wishing for some overall change that might affect the centre, that might kind of come tomorrow or in 100 years' time, whether that's to do with art, design, and education, climate change, health.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, I thought it was really interesting in that session to hear from somebody like Sarah Lovell, who's very knowingly involved in the UK's political deregulation, which could simply seem to be financial on one hand, but on the other hand, how do you work strategically within that to genuinely empower people and not simply to pay lip service to forms of deregulation? How do you use art as a social tool for real change? And equally to hear from Annie and Manolo about how they've worked with a range of toolkits that they often take from Zapatismo to not simply try to replicate or to kind of align themselves to the radicality of Zapatismo, which is kind of a very Western thing to do, isn't it? To kind of, I'm knowledgeable about these other kind of things, so I'm kind of radical by association, and to say actually that's a very colonialist point of view, and to kind of use these tools as forms of constituent decolonization, we have to find difficult negotiated ways of using these tools to enable us to think ourselves otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what we were beginning to arrive at last week, that we just can't do that on our own from the West. There's got to be some points that we begin to actually find ways to work with people who are approaching thinking other ways for us to learn from.
Mm-hmm.
And to teach ourselves and to be taught. And I think that's where those ideas that you've been developing around hacking education begin to come into their own, really.
Yeah, yeah. I was also thinking that perhaps last week was one of the first time that we were also discussing the effect of the pandemic somehow
Yeah.
with respect to of course to the economy, but of course like this idea of the pandemic has always been there in the background, but I think it was interesting to see that it emerged in both the workshop led by Owen Griffith and the panel discussion. And specifically, Owen was talking about the pandemic as a portal, or like the possibility of thinking
Yeah.
about the pandemic as a portal. And I thought that it was, of course, quite useful to think about the pandemic in these terms when it's related to his idea of digging where you stand, or digging where we stand, which is actually a very interesting way of rethinking our relationship to the place where we live, like to our locality. And the same idea um, of the like the importance and the meaning of the encounter, like the physical encounter, was also something that Manolo Callahan and Nanny Paradise were actually quite quite mentioning quite a lot, like the idea of taking seriously the moment of encounter, whether if it happens online or offline, that's another kind of story. But this idea of try to fight a little bit this isolation and atomization, which is also something that Kubat Threader was talking about, because it's something that somehow neoliberalism produced, like the separation of, like people, because we become like economic agent on top of everything else. So it was quite interesting to think about the effect of isolation um, that were not just caused only by the pandemic, but for sure reinforced by the pandemic. And also to think about how can we actually use this condition to also rethink how we can be together while we are apart, and also how can we create transnational networks of solidarity, and but like sincere solidarity, which is somehow something that happened during like the past year, and now it's a little bit losing, but I think eventually we're going to go back into that. But all this idea of taking like what we are learning from this moment, and how can we use this moment and these discussions also to rethink the way we work. I think that was quite interesting, and it eventually came out from the conversation last week. So I thought it was quite like quite nice that it was mentioned in both the meetings.
No, I think you're right, and I think that's crucial. I mean, looking forward to the next set of discussions, which start to kind of take on our relationship to whatever this thing called neoliberalism is a bit more full bloodedly. It seems to me that most northern hemisphere governments in particular are rushing headlong to reset the financial and political clock back to 1 minute before midnight, almost because some of the opportunities that began to raise themselves during the pandemic, when people were helping each other, where local economies started to bloom and flourish, was something that was at odds with the way that global chains of economy work,
Mm.
and isn't something that they can reconcile themselves with particularly easily. I think something very similar happened um, after the financial collapse of 2007. The solution was to get as close to being just before the collapse happened
Mm-hmm.
as 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 could possibly be. And I think these ideas of kind of radical localism,
Mm-hmm.
of digging where you stand, that are emerging and became manifest because of the COVID pandemic, um, are also incredibly interesting, because before they manifested themselves during the pandemic, it was easy to dismiss them as kind of the localism of nationalism or
Yeah.
isolationism,
Yeah.
and to see globalization as the endless networking of humanity. And now it's much more easy to see neoliberal globalization as a form of economic closure, and connected solidarity through localization as being an alternative way of trying to think and live ourselves otherwise. And without going into it too much, one of the things that I've started to think about since last week as well, or since 2 weeks ago, has been, I'm starting to try to think of neoliberalism not as a loose, shaggy dog of a collective noun, which might be so all encompassing that it's almost worthless. I think that's a kind of a trap you can fall into, because then it trundles on and you can't kind of get hold of it. I'm starting to realise that it might be the dominant form by which we represent ourselves to ourselves and each other. It's the way we think of ourselves and describe ourselves and understand ourselves, to the extent that it's almost impossible to think of life and community and work and exchange and our personal lives in other ways than those that are um, atomized and financialized to the nth degree. And, and maybe these forms of digging where you stand, and radical localism and hacking education are necessary attempts to find ways that we can represent ourselves beyond that system,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And I'm also quite looking forward to tomorrow, which is going to be the third week, where we are going to really touch upon these aspects that were coming during the course of the second week, especially the idea of infrastructures and protocols. So together with Poppy Bowers, who is going to moderate the panel of tomorrow, 19th of November. We are going to talk about reclaiming the economy as a social activity by the means of art. And we decided to invite panelists and guests who are actually working across art and economy, and in very different ways, because they work in very different, matters. They are trying to actually infiltrate the economy with their practice, um, introducing new models of thinking about the economy. So they are going to be Catherine Baum, Laura Clark, who is the artistic director of Arts Catalyst, and Bahar Nourizadeh, who is the initiator of a platform called Weird Economies. So I'm quite, like looking forward to that, because I think they are gonna talk about how to rethink infrastructures and protocol in the practice. And for the workshop, then we are going to actually think about the neoliberalism and the imagination. And I'm quite looking forward to that. It's going to be led by Ruth Bale and Amy Fenech as the Alternative School of Economics in collaboration with artist Marcus Coates. So I think we are going to approach the topic through a 1 hour guided meditation to think about neoliberalism and the imagination. So I'm quite curious to approach also the workshop in this matter, and to see what is gonna emerge from this third week.
No, I'm looking forward to it too, and then to having an opportunity to reflect on that again with you, and before we move on further with the Decentralised and Political Economies project. It's great.
Yeah. All right.